The number of Nigerian doctors leaving Nigeria for the UK on a monthly basis. It's a staggering number. I don't want to mislead your audience by giving a particular number, but it's a consequential number. It's a consequential figure. So, from the point of view of the UK and the National Health Service, the NHS, that's great. You're basically getting doctors who have been trained in another part of the world, and all you have to do is to process them through the UK system. My class was half Nigerian, half Cameroonian, my graduate class for my master's in international relations. Those Cameroonians, this was the Obafemi University in Ile-Ife, in Nigeria. Those Cameroonians were paying dollars, who were paying naira. So the Nigerian university.
The Beyond Africa podcast. Welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast, the only platform where experts share their views on African issues.
Welcome back to the Beyond Africa podcast. And today with me, I have Dr. Ebenezer Obadare, who is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Have you ever followed any conversations about immigration in the United States? There is no middle ground in such conversations. But in a recently published opinion piece, Dr. Ebenezer Obadare tries to strike that middle ground. And we're going to hear from him why he did that and any reactions he has gotten from any of the sides of these conversations, and if he thinks that his proposals could actually lead to a solution on the divisiveness or the divisive issues on immigration, especially in the United States. Dr. Ebenezer Obadare, you're welcome to Beyond Africa.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. You're the first person on this program in 2025, so Happy New Year.
Wishing you the same, my friend.
Thank you. I hope the year ended on a good footing, and it's also starting on a good footing. I know you are snow locked down, but that could be something good.
Yeah, I know. It's gotten off to a great start, so I can't complain.
Amazing. I saw your article on immigration debate worth having. I thought it's nice to talk to you because the Beyond Africa podcast focuses on how immigration can affect, or how the African diaspora can influence the continent. And immigration is one of those things. If you and I are here, it's because we followed the immigration path. But you take a different tone. Why did you decide to strike a conciliatory tone on a conversation where people appear to be more emotional or ideological?
Thank you for the question. So maybe a little bit of background, just to note that this is not actually the first time I've written an article that basically takes the position you've referred to. This is something I've been saying consistently for at least the last 5 years. And my argument has always been that insofar as we should all be concerned about immigration, that there is always this particular aspect that we tend to leave unattended and that tends to fall between the cracks. So the standard framing of the immigration debate goes like this, especially if you are speaking from here in the West. How many people should be allowed in? From what countries? Should there be legal migration, versus open borders, as we've seen over the last few years? The way I see it, all those things are extremely important. And I think that it's one of the manifestations of a very lively and democratic society that people talk openly, frankly, and vigorously about issues of concern. And nothing is more concerning, especially if you look back to one of the reasons people gave for voting the way they did in the last American elections.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think next to the economy, people said, immigration, from the southern border. So again, underscoring the fact that this thing continues to animate passion in different parts of the American society. My worry is that when we do all of that, we tend to leave out the impact of immigration on the so-called sending countries. You're from Cameroon, I'm from Nigeria. And it seems to me that for us, at least, the most important question has to be, why is it that the countries that you and I come from keep bleeding human capital? more than 20,000, an average of 20,000 African academics and PhDs and PhD students leave the continent every year. The question is why? And when you raise that question, you begin to look very closely at questions of governance, of transparency, of total social organization in these countries. Now, it is true that people have always moved across borders. And as we speak, people continue to move across borders, especially within Africa. West Africa, Central Africa. So people continue to move. Sometimes the movement is mandated, because of conflict or because of some kind of human emergency. At other times, it's because people are desperate for opportunity. That's taken for granted. But what cannot be doubted is that over the last 3 decades at least, more and more people from the places that you and I come from have been making this move to other parts of the world. As I'm speaking to you, there are people doing African studies in places like Singapore, in Cyprus, in Malaysia, in Brazil. So there's something going on out there that the current tenor and the focus of the conversation in this part of the world does not capture. And what I wanted to do was, in the first instance, to acknowledge the importance of that debate in this part of the world, at the same time to intrude, to interject into that debate matters that are of concern to people, communities, and societies in the so-called sending countries. So that's the background to what I wrote, and that, in a nutshell, is my central argument.
Yeah, that sounds quite interesting because on this podcast, we take the view that we should look at the African problem from the African perspective, not from another perspective. So we tell the story from our own side. And you've made a very nice point there. But I wonder, why did you drop this particular sentence at the end of the article? It says, ultimately, the best immigration policy is one that helps developing countries hold onto their best talent. So why is that at the very end? Is it because you know that people will definitely read the last sentence, or is that a summation of all the arguments you've made?
It's a when you are writing an article like this, you're basically playing with 1,000 words, more or less. So there's a lot that you have to leave unsaid or leave for another occasion. But I felt that I needed to end on that telling note to drive home the point I was making. And the point being, again, excuse me, as I said earlier, it's extremely important to discuss migration in an American context. But again, the more important thing for you and I is to think about the impact of immigration on the countries that you and I have left. It tends to be taken for granted that when intellectuals, medical doctors, pharmacists, architects, agriculturists, athletes, when they leave a particular society, in this case, the African continent, there's a vacuum that is created. Every conversation that we have about development ultimately devolves to the question of human capital, right? So we have a conversation about, are you getting me? The assumption in all those conversations, especially as those conversations relate to Africa, is that the human capital has to be there to enact those visions of development. When the human capital is not there and its poverty is taken for granted, there is a problem. And that's what I was trying to do. So I was trying to say, look, Basically, that last sentence which you quoted, I think, was directed to people in this part of the world who make a case for migrants. I'm one of those people. I'm an immigrant. But I'm also saying at the same time that it's not enough to say, let them come in. It's also important to say, to ask, one, why do they continue to leave? And what is the impact of their departure on the countries that they are leaving behind? The best way to help Africa is to help Africa keep its best. Its lawyers, its pharmacists, its doctors, its intellectuals. That's my point.
That is a very smooth point that I would really love everyone to understand. Like you mentioned the recent debate on X about the H1B visa, on who is coming, who should come to the United States and who should not come. And it was all focused on bringing in the best talent. So that is an argument that we need to reverse and see how it works on the continent of Africa. Africa is sending out its best talent. India is sending out their best talent also. But the conversation about H1B focused entirely on India and touched very little on Africa. But that said, we still have our own best who are leaving the continent. You've mentioned 20,000 people already every year. So where do you put this conversation? Because those who are for immigration will not totally agree with you. And those who are against immigration will tell you Africans should solve their problems. How do you reconcile this in view of the H1B visa conversation?
It's a great question. I've been following that conversation. Thanks for bringing it up. Here's my point, my friend. So let me give you a brief anecdote. When I did my master's in Nigeria in the early 90s, my class was half Nigerian, half Cameroonian, my graduate class for my master's in international relations. Those Cameroonians, this was the Obafemi University in Ile-Ife in Nigeria. Those Cameroonians were paying dollars, who were paying naira. So the Nigerian university, that university was making money from the presence of those foreign students in Nigeria. Right now, the Nigerian students and the Cameroonian students would rather study in the Netherlands, in the US, in France, in Belgium, than in Nigeria. So here is a very interesting way to think about the H1B visa. What about Nigeria having an H1B visa program to attract other African countries? What about Nigeria having the equivalent of an H1B visa regime to attract Americans, Europeans, Canadians? That's my problem. I'm not saying that the United States should not get the best. It should. It's the United States. That's the whole point of the American idea. But it takes for granted that there's a pool of people out there that the United States can and should always draw upon. I'm flipping the coin here. I'm saying that pool, one, is not inexhaustible. Two, there are real problems in those countries that we don't talk about, but we focus only instead on their capacity to produce that capital for Western countries. So let me give you an example. I'm looking on the actual number now, but I think the Nigerian Medical Association released, I think about 2-3 months ago, you can go and double check this. The number of Nigerian doctors leaving Nigeria for the UK on a monthly basis. It's a staggering number. I don't want to mislead your audience by giving a particular number, but it's a consequential number. It's a consequential figure. So from the point of view of the UK and the National Health Service, the NHS, that's great. You're basically getting doctors who have been trained in another part of the world, and all you have to do is to process them through the UK system. If you're a UK citizen, it's a win-win. They've already been trained, remember? And all you have to do It's just processed. So you're not even paying for the overhead. I don't have any problem with that. I support human capital going to wherever it is welcome, it is cherished, and privileged. My point is, how do we ensure that Nigeria stop losing its doctors? How do we ensure that Cameroon stop losing its doctors? And look, when I say this, I'm not just concerned about the loss of doctors, academics, pharmacists. I'm concerned as well about what is called brawn drain as opposed to brain drain. Brawn drain meaning emigration, for example, of athletes. Think about your average national football team. And I know a lot about this because I'm an aficionado. I pay a lot of attention to what we call in Africa football. It's soccer, but in here they will call it soccer, right?
Yep.
Look at the composition of the average national team. Think about the Indomitable Lions, right? In the 80s, in the age of Emelu Bombo, Cyril Makanaki, Benjamin Masin, Emmanuel Kunde, Thomas Susono, Roger Miller, and all these guys, they all plied their wares in the country.
Yeah.
Right? There was a very serious, very, very watchable Cameroonian league, right? Tonere Kalala, Union Douala. What happened?
Please, Kumu Strikers, don't forget Kumu Strikers.
Okay, I won't.
That is my hometown team.
In Nigeria too, stationery stores, ICC, Rangers, right? Those leagues are no longer up to snuff. What happened? How can we make sure that African leagues keep the best African players, right? Think about the best, the African footballer of the year for the last 3, 5, 8, 10 years. They've all been Africans who ply their wares outside the country, outside the continent. As a matter of fact, the winner for last year, Demola Lookman, who plays for Atalanta, was not even born in Nigeria. He was born in London. He has a London accent. The only reason he got that was because of his quote unquote African ancestry. If he had broken into the Everton team and had been successful, he probably would be playing for England and he wouldn't have been qualified. So you get my point.
Yeah.
I'm trying to refocus this entire conversation so that it's not just about what does the United States do with the human capital that flows toward it. I want us in the same breath, not to the detriment of, not at the expense of. I want us in the same breath to think about where the human capital is flowing from, whether it is professionals, social scientists, or athletes.
Yeah, so with this conversation now, you already mentioned governance and democracy, things and all the other stuff. We all know are not very good on the continent, and these are factors that push people out. So to whom are you talking in this? Are you talking to Donald Trump, or are you talking to Biden, or are you talking to the future presidents or politicians of the United States? Are you talking to them in the West, or are you talking to the African leaders?
I'm talking to all of those people and more, right? Primarily, I'm talking to people who continue to have a conversation about immigration, period. I'm also talking to Africans like myself in the diaspora. I'm trying to say, let's have a conversation about this. How should we think differently about this? And how should we re-examine our fundamental assumptions about this? But most important, I'm also talking to African leaders. I'm saying your citizens are voting with their feet. Even you, when you and your family members need, for example, medical assistance, you go outside the country, outside the continent. The former Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, I think the first part of his first 4 years in office, spent, I think, 7 or 8 months in a London hospital, right? This was the same guy. This is the same guy who, the first time he took over power as a soldier in December 1983, sounded this keynote about Nigerian hospitals becoming consulting clinics. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since that time. But apparently, if as president, 3 or 4 decades later, he still had to seek medical attention abroad, then it means that either nothing has changed or the situation has gotten worse. So my message is addressed to leaders, to members of civil society, ordinary citizens, to those who shape conversation here in the West, and also Africans in the diaspora.
This platform is intended to shape such conversations, but not from the diasporan or from the Western perspective, but from the African diasporan perspective. So we start talking about ourselves and looking for alternative solutions to what others have proposed. You've mentioned the presidents and the governments with the example of Nigeria. Yes, we know all this. It's been happening since the 1960s when we acquired our independence. Nothing is changing. Is the problem us now, or is the problem the leaders?
So this is a very simple answer for me. The answer is neither, because it's not either or. My perspective or my approach has always been a whole, what you might call a whole of society approach. What that means is that I don't make any artificial distinctions between leaders and followers, right? There is a sense in which both leaders and citizens are wrapped up in an entire social dynamic. So it does not help my analysis to put leaders in one tight compartment and then put followers in another tight silo, right? What I try to do in my work is to understand the overall dynamic of the dynamics in which followers and leaders are wrapped up. What is useful for me is to point a finger to the entire society as a whole. Because look, when you talk about leaders, for instance, it's not as if we've had only one set of leaders in any African country since independence, right? There have been leadership changes, for the most part. So
in some countries.
Yeah. So there's a political cultural soil from which both leaders and citizens emerge and from which they draw sustenance. My interest is to think about that subsoil that gives life to leadership and following at the same time, instead of trying to erect an artificial distinction or separation between.
So when you place your finger on that subsoil that gives birth to the leaders and the followers at the same time, what have you identified as the problems on the continent when it comes to governance that is a critical push factor? I ask this because I want us to switch to talk about what role the diaspora can play to ameliorate the situation in Africa. But before then, what have you identified as the main problem that leaders and followers seem not to identify?
The central problem for me, and this is something I'm trying to wrap my head around in the book I'm working on. I think one thing that appears to be constant, whether you're talking about Burkina Faso or Uganda, Nigeria or South Africa, is the way in which what used to be a consensus on norms, right? How that consensus has either frayed or disintegrated completely. If you think about Nigeria, for instance. So, what does it mean to hold public office and to be accountable? How are leaders supposed to behave? What are the expectations from people who hold political office? What are their entitlements and what are the obligations? If you look across many African countries, I would say majority of them, people no longer have any kind of clarity on answers to these questions. So you have a situation where people in power, my friend, literally get away with murder. that basic sense of accountability is not there. And what used to be the archive of knowledge in terms of how to hold people accountable, that the archive is no longer there. Now, the logical question would then be, how did that happen? It's happened in different countries in different ways, but I think one thing that seems to be a common denominator, across this country is military rule. In the early 60s up to the early 70s, many African countries struggled. The first batch of nationalist leaders who took over from the colonial overlords struggled. There was a lot of crises, of ethnic, regional, and religious dimensions. In many places, a combination of those. What military intervention in these countries did was to not allow politicians to develop the muscle to solve those questions, right? To resolve these questions. So let me quickly, let's leave Africa for a moment, because I think there's something instructive going on that helps me illustrate this point. I don't know if you've been following events in South Korea. South Korea is in the middle of a constitutional crisis. The president tried to impose some form of martial rule. Everyday citizens rebuffed him, right? Right now, the country is torn between how to remove the president and how to put another president, and the law is being interpreted in a million ways. You know what my reaction to that is? I said, for South Korea, good for you, right? Because at the end of the day, this is going to be resolved one way or another, and South Korea's democracy is going to be better for it. The worst thing that can happen for South Korea right now is for any outside force, foreign influence, or the military to step in and say, there's an emergency, I'm going to help you solve this problem. When you do that, you are basically disallowing society from learning from its own mistakes. So let's come back to Africa. My argument is that in the 60s and 70s, when the military overthrew various civilian dispensations, they set the foundation for this normative crisis that I'm describing. And many of these countries are yet to recover from that crisis.
I love the thesis, and I would like us to meet again and develop it so people understand where you're coming from and what proposals you have. Let's switch gears and talk about the next few months of immigration in the United States. Then we talk about the diaspora. What are your predictions for the new Trump presidency and immigration, especially African immigration?
No, number one, I don't like to predict.
That is a job as an analyst.
Yeah, I leave that to Prophet. But I think what we can do is to try and make some extrapolations from what the incoming administration, what President Trump has already promised that he's going to do. Apparently, he has a mandate to expel those who have come into the country, to arrest and expel those who have come into the country illegally. And there appears also to be some form of consensus on immigration in the country, meaning most people agree that the last 4 years of Biden administration, insofar as its open borders policy is concerned, that it's not been the right path for the country, and the country should move in a different direction. I don't think it's a rejection of immigration. There's some of that on the far right, but I think most Americans, this is my reading, most Americans seem to be saying, we want people to come into the country. We need highly skilled people to come into the country. We need low-skilled people in different sectors of the economy, in agriculture, in trade, in labor, and all of that. We need all of those, but we want people to come into the country legally. So my prediction is that, especially because it was so critical to the way to his election as president, that President Trump would try to deport a lot of people who have come into the country illegally. And I also think that in doing so is going to run into a lot of opposition from businesses and from members of the democratic opposition who will try to put us all manner of obstacles in his way. Where does Africa come in all of this? I don't know the actual numbers of Africans who have come into the country through the southern border or illegally. And insofar as those people are there in whatever numbers, I think they will rightly be worried about what's going to happen to them. But I think the middle ground here for me, looking beyond the Trump administration, and this sort of maybe pertains to the argument I was making earlier about immigration. For me, it seems that the common sense thing to do from an American perspective is to balance a generous migration policy with security at the border. I don't think there's a contradiction there. And I think if you ask most Americans, and I think I reference some figures in that piece of mine, I think like maybe 60% of the country, maybe even higher, continue to believe that immigration is a net positive for the country. So those people are not, most Americans are not against immigration. Now, there are people on the far right who do not want people to come in. My piece was not addressed to those people. And there are people on the extreme left who think that borders are not necessary. Again, my piece is not addressed to those people. I'm trying to have a conversation with people who think that immigration is a net positive, but who also don't think that there's anything wrong with having security at the border.
You referenced the Gallup poll, which says that a comfortable majority of Americans, 64%, still say that immigration is a good thing. And it goes on to say more than half of Americans, including 42% of Democrats, said they will support mass deportation of illegal immigrants. And I think the catch here is the term illegal immigrants. And there's been a lot of conversation about this. Some people take out illegal and some people refusing to qualify that a class of immigrants as illegal, and saying everybody is welcome to the United States. And do you find that deceitful to immigrants who are coming to the United States by them listening to people who say, okay, come in illegally, but then once you come in, you're not illegal? Does that create some kind of confusion in the minds of immigrants before they move in here?
Yeah, I just think it's disappointing because I don't think the whole no borders thing is well thought out. Especially, I mean, look, a couple of things here. One, I don't think it's unfair for anybody who lives within a society, a citizen of a country who pays taxes. Forget about the country. It could be Nigeria, it could be any country, for people to then have a conversation about how many people do we want to have in our country? Where do we want them from? And are there people we should avoid for the sake of our national cohesion and security? Like, I think people can and ought to have that conversation. And not only that, if people are not having that conversation, it actually says something about the quality of the democracy that people are not having that conversation. I think that's my first point. The second thing is the idea that any country, again, not just the United States, not Canada, any country will leave open its borders and anybody will come in and it's going to be sweetness and light, everything is going to be fine. No country does that. And if you put pressure on people to accept that, you are laying a foundation for political disaster. And sitting where we are today, 6th of January, incidentally, a very remarkable date in America, if you know what I mean. I think there's no disputing the fact that one of the reasons the Vice President Kamala Harris lost to President Donald Trump is that Americans just felt that the Democratic Party had done them wrong by its open border policy. I think I was reading a New York Times article the other day. I think the Biden administration let in an estimated 5 million people.
Good.
Yeah, it's, and we can double check that number. I think 5 million. Yeah, if I'm right. Look, you being pro-immigration is a good thing. I am pro-immigrant. I'm pro-immigration. I'm an immigrant, and I'm proud to be an American. Call myself an American today. But I think it's not. There's nothing wrong or racist or far right about saying people should come into the country legally. And that's why I said what I said earlier, that the path forward, the way to avoid the open borders crowd on the far left and the no immigration crowd on the far right, is to rally around this very pragmatic, very defensible idea of generous migration and secure borders. I think it's something that most Americans would easily rally around.
Yeah, I think we'll be seeing that in the next few months. We'll see the proposals that the Trump administration is going to put forward around immigration, and that could shape the conversations going forward. I want to be mindful of the time. Do you have about 10 more minutes for us to look at?
Okay, let's do it, my friend. Let's do it.
Let's hit on what the diaspora can do, because as we've said, the problem is governance and we are out this way. We've learned a lot of things. We've created networks, and we now have the capacity to influence policy back home or even influence activities back home. How do you think the African diaspora can contribute to changing things? I mean, practical changing things on the continent.
So before answering that, I'm going to preface my remarks with a problem. So I'm going to encourage you to read. I did a different piece on the woman who is now the leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, who is of Nigerian ancestry, Mrs. Kemi. A country and its
diaspora.
A country and its diaspora. I got it. Okay, so Mrs. Kemi Badenoch. So one of the key points I was trying to make in the article that is pertinent to the question you've asked is we tend to assume that the people in the diaspora and the people back home are always on the same page, right? Part of what we see with the reaction to Mrs. Badenoch's politics is that is not always the case. Yeah. That sometimes people back home disagree virulently with people in the diaspora and vice versa. So I wanted to just put that out there as a backdrop to the answer I'm going to give you on the question of the diaspora, which is, having taken into consideration the fact that relations between people in the diaspora and people back home can be problematic and challenged and often uneven, I think one of the things that people in the diaspora can do is to rally around institutions, individuals, ideas, and agents that help strengthen democracy in Africa. I think that's the most important contribution that people in the diaspora can make. That's coming from my own understanding that the most important problem that African countries face is strengthening, deepening, and thickening their democracy. And that the more democratic those countries become, the better they will be in every facet of their lives. And the more democratic they become, the better they become, the less that they will hemorrhage human capital the way they've been hemorrhaging it over the last 2 to 3 decades. So here's a way to put it. It's almost like a formula. Ultimately, people in the diaspora are working towards the reduction of the number of people coming to the diaspora. Do you understand?
I get that. And I'm loving
that's the leg of it. The other leg of it is we have to work towards getting to a point where it's not as challenging as it currently is for people here to say, I'm going to go back to Cameroon. There's this particular project in Yaoundé that I think can benefit from my skill set. And I'm going to go back home because there's enough recognition for what I'm doing. There's enough respect for what I'm doing. I know that the society needs it. And there is no threat to the security of me and my family. We have to get to that point so that even if institutionally, there is no organization doing that, as was the case, for instance, in the aftermath of the Rwanda crisis, when different global organizations got together and helped to repatriate vital human expertise back to the country, and I think that's been a success, to some extent. But I'm looking at a situation where, people through word of mouth look at what's going on the ground and say, you know what? I think things have changed to such an extent that it's safe for me to go back and contribute my little bit to the development of the society. I used to be an academic. So in my own case, you're looking at a situation where I think I can develop robust collaborations with different African universities, colleges, and/or think tanks.
Absolutely. I'm currently writing a piece where I'm making an argument that African governments and African institutions should establish collaborations with American universities where they can contribute to establishing laboratories for AI in Africa, so they can have the raw data from Africa to train whatever they're training with the specificity of Africa. So there is no bias, discrimination, anything falling through the cracks. As you're saying, academics need to do that. We need to keep thinking and talking about collaborations.
Absolutely. But yes, every little helps. All good ideas are welcome, no matter where those ideas are coming from. But the reason I was focusing on the politics is because of what I've also learned from my own work and research over the years, which is if you don't get the politics right, nothing is going to work. The political foundation has to be secure. Institutions have to be working. You need that level of political stability and predictability. And we're getting there. So for Nigeria, for instance, since 1999, Nigeria has experienced no military rule. And for the first time in last year's election, there was no former soldier standing for office, right? I know. It's now, were the elections perfect? No. Is the situation right in the country? No. Is there work to be done, my brother? Absolutely. But you can sort of see progress, and you can see the makings, the beginnings of a process that is going to last for decades to come. And what I think those of us in the diaspora can do is to write about it, to challenge it, to criticize it, to engage with it materially and morally, with a view to strengthening that foundation so that it can be to the benefit of not just Nigerians, but anybody who wants to come and work in Nigeria. I'm coming back to my idea of Nigerian H1B. Like, Nigeria should, with its population of 220 million and counting, be able to attract the best anywhere in the world. I'm looking forward to a situation to that future, where somebody wakes up in Norway and says, I want to go and work and teach in a Nigerian university because that's the place where I can do my research.
That's very brilliant, and I also look forward to that day. And it's our job to work towards that, as we are already doing, as you do in your pieces. We just need to keep the fire going. But one other question that I wanted to ask is, when it comes to the proposal you made about rallying around the leadership and institutions to build democracy and better governance on the continent, do you foresee any technical challenges or any permanent challenges? Because sometimes the home government, as you say, the relationship between the diaspora and the home front is not always very smooth. Do you foresee a situation where the home politicians consider the diasporans as a threat to their power?
Absolutely, and we've seen many examples of that. Where people went back home, tried to make contributions in different fields, they were frustrated, and eventually they had to go back. So it's important to go in with the eyes wide open and to realize that you'll be stepping into a social space that is riddled with all kinds of contradictions. However, we've also seen very positive examples. I was just thinking about this now. The current president of the Gambia, I think he used to live in the UK, if I remember correctly. You can fact check this. I think he lived in London, and then go back. Part of what he was selling was the idea that he was exposed to the UK parliamentary system. He knew how the system worked, and the country bought what he was selling, and is currently the president. So we have successful examples that we can use as a model, and then we have examples also where people have faced challenges. So we can learn from both. But the whole idea is to not assume that because people are in the diaspora, they will be necessarily embraced by people back at home. There are tensions in the relationship between the two that are not often sufficiently accounted for in the literature and in everyday conversations.
Absolutely. And one other point I think we could also talk about here is the diaspora consciously sponsoring or supporting a movement or an idea or a political party or a leader they think and know can actually bring positive change to their countries. That is a fundamental step that people can start taking to make sure that their voices come from the diaspora.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Obadare, thank you so much for being on Beyond Africa today. Do you have any last words for our viewers? I know you will come back.
No, the only thing I'd like to say is to just thank you for having me. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think the need for a platform such as yours cannot be overemphasized. I want to congratulate you for the wonderful work you're doing, and I hope to be, to be part of this this platform. And I look forward to coming back at some point in the foreseeable future. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obadare, for coming. And like you said, the platform is open to every African. The idea here is just to have people share their ideas, share their experiences, where they have succeeded, where they have not succeeded, the challenges they have faced. And of course, another person will tell them how they went around those challenges in order to advocate for the advancement of Africa, because Africa is ours. The fact that we've left from Africa does not mean in any way that we should forget about Africa. Some people in the diaspora tend to forget about the continent, but that is not the way things should happen. If God made us Africans, it's because he knew that we had a mission to advance Africa's prosperity. So we should have that very close to our hearts and contribute to the development of the continent. Despite the difficulties, they are there, the challenges are there, but we can do something to move the continent forward.
Totally.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this program. I will call on you to like this channel, subscribe to the channel, and share these conversations with your friends. That is the only energy we have to keep going. We don't have any other energy to keep going apart from letting us know that when people like Dr. Obadare leave their work and come here, they are listened to, and the conversations, which we find very interesting, are also shared across the board to enlighten and inform others. So thank you so much, and see you next time.